Well, everyone, good evening and thanks for attending. It is, I'm sorry, I have my window open. I got to close it here. I just heard my sprinkler come on in the yard, so I better close my window. There we go. So good evening to everyone who's logged on and welcome. Before we get started, I'd like to do some housekeeping things. I'll introduce myself, our speakers, and share some housekeeping information. We are recording the webinar this evening and we will make it available on demand for our members. If you're experiencing difficulties with audio or video, usually the best solution is to log out and then back in again. If that doesn't work, we will be sending out instructions on how to view the on-demand version, so please watch for BCDHA communications, but we'll keep our fingers crossed and hope that everybody's able to hear and see everything that we want to share this evening, so thanks for joining. My name is Wendy Jobs, and I'm the moderator for this webinar this evening. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize all of the traditional territories upon which dental hygienists work. I am the BCDHA Manager of Dental Hygiene Practice, and with me is your presenters, Jen Smith and Connie Chong from the First Nations Health Authority. You should be directed to a survey at the conclusion of the webinar, so please take a few minutes and complete, excuse me, this for us, as your feedback helps us make decisions and provide quality events for you. I've been with BCDHA for several years now. I am a dental hygienist. I love my job. I was also an educator for 20 years, and I have worked in residential care, general and periodontal practices. I currently have 2 dogs and 3 grown children, one of which still lives with me. So thanks everyone for attending. The webinar tonight is approximately 60 minutes long. There will be an opportunity at the end. We might go a little bit over the hour, so just to give everybody a heads up, if you choose to stay, we'll try and do the question and answers at 7 o'clock. So if you feel inclined, please hang out and ask some questions. I'm just going to quickly review the Zoom platform, which is what we're using this evening. In order to see the menu bar, which is this section down here, usually you have to move your mouse or tap your screen and the menu bar should pop open for you. Here you can see the, hang on just one sec here, I'll show you here. If you click down here, the audio settings, you can bring up where your microphone and your speakers are. Tonight, none of the attendees can speak, so if you have any questions, you can send it to me in the chat function. You can raise and lower a hand. I'm not quite sure exactly how that would work because you can't speak, but the best way to contact us is through the chat function right here. You can put your question in here and send it to me and I'll see it, and then I'll ask Connie and Jen what your questions are. Just a reminder that you can log into your CDHBC online learning platform and add this particular activity to your plan. We do not offer certificates, so the best suggestion is to keep your registration information, your notes, and any other documentation that might demonstrate your learning. CDHBC has also recently made it possible for you to scan and upload electronic documents, so you can house that type of information directly in your online profile. I've used it several times and it works quite slick, and I like it so that I don't have to actually keep hard copies of things if I don't want to. Remember that the suggestions we make for CE credits are just that, it's just a suggestion. It is up to each member to decide how this particular event fits into your overall professional development activities. So I'd like to just very briefly introduce Jen Smith, is from the Clo-et-Sea. Sorry, Jen, I tried my best. From the Clo-et-Sea Nation located on Vancouver Island. And she is working in the health benefits as a community relation representative for the Vancouver Coastal Region for the First Nations Health Authority. So welcome, Jen. Connie Chong is the Manager of Provider Relations at the First Nations Health Authority. And thanks for joining us, both Jen and Connie. I'm going to now turn it over to Jen.
Awesome. Let's hope everyone cross their fingers now our tech works out.
No worries. Just give us a sec while we change screens here. We have to change access points here within the system. There we go. I can see it. Perfect.
Okay, we're in.
Looks great, Jen. Thanks.
Gela Kesla, Gela Kes Dakula, Nuko am tlatlak wot. Gayu tlaslak kalaguis. Gayu tlaslak mimkomlis. Ola kiala ikyok datnala. Gala kasla. Also want to acknowledge the traditional territories of which we're all on. I'll start with my own. I'm living in Pitt Meadow, so I'm on Stalo territory. And then I'll just mention Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh as well, and the rest of the attendees. I don't know where you are, but I give acknowledgement to that territory as well. I've told you that my traditional name is Standing Together in Strength. I come from Turner Island and Village Island, and today is a great day. Thank you and welcome. So here's our overview of what we're going to go through today. I'm going to begin the presentation with a brief history of First Nations in BC, given to you from my perspective. An intro to FNHA. Connie's going to go into the remainder of the outline here, oral health program and the benefits transformation journey, and then cultural safety and humility learning pathway. So we're going to try to get you in and out so you can continue on with the rest of your evening. I'll let Connie.
I actually don't have access to the poll anymore because I think Wendy's the host now. So Wendy, you might have to pop up the first poll question.
Do we wait for the results, Con? Oh, there we go. Excellent. So we have about 68% that agree that you are aware of the past and present impacts of Canada's colonial history on Indigenous peoples. Neutral and I don't know about the same, 15 and 14%, and then about 3% disagree that you don't.
Perfect.
That's okay.
I'll stop sharing the results here. Is that okay, Jen?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, there we go.
All right, it seems to be frozen.
Oh, your computer's frozen? Oh, there we go.
Okay. Fingers crossed. Okay, everybody, we are going to look at the history of First Nations in BC. And when it says a coastal perspective, it means from my perspective, I am a coastal First Nations, meaning that my nation, my traditional territory was located along the coast. So I come from two villages. We are patrilineal. So we identify first with my father's village from Turner Island, which is Clowitsis, and my mother's village was Village Island, which is Mimquamlis. So we'll go through a little bit of that throughout this presentation. I will give the forewarning that some of what we will discuss is heavy in nature and difficult. It's not an easy presentation to give for myself. So as many times as I've delivered it, I have to always really be mindful of self-care. Some things can be triggering. So please, I encourage you to be aware of that and to take care of yourselves as you need to. For me, that looks like when I get triggered, it catches me off guard, it comes out of the blue, and I just need to recognize it and then talk with my partner or just talk it out. So I start with an intro to me. We look at where I come from And that is the picture you see of a very young me at the age of 19 with both of my grandmothers and my mother and my firstborn daughter, Janet. She's the baby there. Those are both of my grandmothers who are gone to the spirit world now. And I named my eldest daughter there, Janet, after my granny Janet, who I've got my arm around. And that just represents where I come from. And the picture on the right there is me with my family now, my partner of, I think we're at 16 years, and my two daughters who are now grown teenagers out of the house. So we've got this whole new life of empty nest, which is a whole new world. So Janet on the right there is 21 and Aaliyah's just turned 18, and that's my partner Dino. So that's my past, my present, and this is how I like to look at this deck as well. We talk about our future. What does the future mean for me? It means this beautiful little boy who has changed my entire life and is the apple of my eye. His name is Mateo. He's my grandson. I was a young mom, so I'm a young grandma. And, you know, he really puts things into perspective for me. Doing the work that I do in health benefits. I think that we are all in a career likely that, you know, we want to make it better. We want to do our best to make things better. And in healthcare, you can really do that for future generations, especially some of the work we're doing at First Nations Health Authority. So that really changes my perspective on things when I think about the next 7 generations. This is it, looking me in the face with those beautiful brown eyes. So like I said, past, present, future, we're going to look a little bit at the past, what pre-contact was like before European contact with First Nations. And then we're going to go into contact, and it gets a little bit heavier. And then we're going to look at the future and our roles moving forward. And I always have to say this, I promise we will end on a positive note because like I said, it can be heavy. It's a heavy, heavy topic. I'm just going to start a timer since we're on a time sensitive. Okay, so this is my Uncle John. First Nations have an oral history. It is what has been passed down through generations and what I like to think of as what has kept our traditions and our culture and all of the things we're about to go through in this deck. That's what's kept it alive, is our traditional oral history. It's those stories being passed down. Much of what was not written in books or anywhere, it was passed down through knowledge. So this is my Uncle John Powell. He's a First Nations artist, politician. He's a celebrity. He's very, very talented. And when he was younger, he was recognized for having an insanely good memory. So my ancestors started to pass down their knowledge to him. So this man is exactly 20 years older than me, and he knows everything. He's just amazing with his memory, and he recognized me for having a good memory, nowhere near as good as his, but so he started transferring knowledge down to me. So every time I see him, it's very repetitive, and we talk a lot, and it needs to be repetitive because that's how it sticks, especially with me not having a great memory like him. But he knows all of the traditional names. He knows about generations back. He knows all of their traditional names, you know, marriages, where the families come from, which villages they come from, all the illegitimate children and who was raising them and who their real parents were. And he just knows it all. So he's amazing. We're going to reference him throughout. And most of this deck was developed based on the knowledge that he's passed down. So there's another saying, there's a saying by an elder named Jerry Ullman from the Statlium territory, and he says, we can't say goodbye to a problem until we say hello to it. The first time I saw that, it took me a minute and I had to reread it. But really that's what we're doing here, is saying hello to it. This education, this history was not taught in schools, likely in my experience skipped over. And now we're at a point in the world where this is, you know, we're talking about reconciliation and moving forward in a good way, but what does that really mean? We're going to talk more about that at the end, but this is us saying hello to this dark colonial history. So Indigenous world view. Culture is our identity. It was pre-contact and it remains so. It includes beliefs about proper conduct in the world, relationships to each other, to the land and its resources. There's an interconnectedness with the land, including all of the plants and animals that belong to the land. The spirituality was a daily practice, whereas now I think that definitely takes a bit of effort. And in my situation, living in the city, we're lucky to have access to like our culture and the spiritual kind of teachings and ways. If we're anywhere near like a big house, which we're not. Health and wellness includes still all aspects of a person: spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical. So those 4 aspects of a person. Another one of my elder mentors, Leonard George from Tsleil-Waututh, just put it so, they just have a way of making things make sense in the easiest way possible. He says, you cannot drive a car with 3 wheels. You have to take care of all 4 aspects of your wellness. So he just likened it to that, and it makes total sense. Family and community were central. And then wealth was a concept that was about what could be given, not what was owned. So we're going to talk a lot about that coming up when we talk about the potlatch. This is a picture of my village, Colagwis. So this is Slawitsis or Turner Island. Colagwis is the traditional name for the island itself, the village, sorry. Now, the picture from 1885, you can see is before contact. This island is about, I've been there once. It's about an 8-hour boat ride from Campbell River, which is where I grew up. And it does not look like any of these pictures anymore, but 1885 was pre-contact. You can see the structure of the houses, what they looked like, canoes on the beach, like a more holistic way of living. The picture on the top, 1933, would have been after contact. So I'm gonna go into a little bit of a funny story of a piece of writing I actually found in doing the research on this on the intranet. Somebody had found our village and they started talking about it. We found another village, Colagwis, more interesting than the others. The clean white beach had borrowed its shape from the new moon. Here, the chief's house, a very civilized little house. So this is my grandfather's house she's referencing at the top there. Such as you can see in any Canadian town, was flanked by 2 incongruous, forbidding figures, each carrying a keg upon his shoulder. What exactly was their significance? I could not imagine. So she writes, the author wrote that, and then after, my grandfather writes, after I built my white man style house, I put the old poles from my father's gyuxi. Gyuxi means house, like the house you see in the 1885 picture. I put the poles from my father's gyuxi alongside. I had to dig new holes and move the poles around so they faced the beach. Just for fun, I put oak barrels on their shoulders where the house beams used to rest. I had a little giggle at that because she was in awe, and he's just like, I just put some oak barrels up there. So we're going to get into talking about the potlatch. This was our governance, our governance model. So the function of a potlatch was to confer status and rank, pass on a family's rights and privileges or inheritance, to celebrate marriage or passing of names, to memorialize, or to restore one's reputation in the community after a humiliation, and then to claim rights to hunting and fishing. Heard some background noise there. I hope everyone can still hear me.
Hi, Jen, it's Wendy. We can hear you fine.
Okay.
I did hear that background noise. I'm not sure what that was, but carry on. I don't hear it anymore.
Okay. So this is what a picture of a big house looks like today, likely very similar. So I could talk all day about this. Big house is what we call it. Keep in mind, when I mentioned that this is a coastal perspective, there are 203 BC First Nations across the province. Just want to ensure that everyone's aware that each one of those 203 nations are different. Some of them are speaking different languages, different dialects, and have different, very different ways of celebrating their culture. So what we call this is our big house. Some people call it a long house. In the interior, there's much different ways of the way that they carry out their culture. That's why I had to brand it that it's a coastal perspective. So high-ranking families would accumulate wealth. This is going back to our concept of wealth, where it was more about what could be given. So we do our business in the big house. We show who we are in the big house, and we invite guests from everywhere to witness this. Another piece of how our culture has survived, our witnesses are our newspaper, if you will, and we want as many people to come, and we're going to feed them all day long. Potlatches can last from 1 day to, back then, up to 2 weeks. So it's a big deal. Nowadays, I would say the longest one I've heard of is maybe 2 days. 3 days is pushing it a little because it does get a bit tiring. It's long. We used to joke about having a potlatch hangover, right? Because we're in there all day long and into the wee hours of the night. But it's an amazing experience. If you are ever invited, I would encourage you to go. So like I mentioned, we feed our guests all day long, breakfast, lunch, dinner. We gift them all day long, and that's our thank you for being the witness to our business that we're carrying out. Passing on of names happens, from my experience, at every potlatch, because we really want to ensure that all the babies are named, so they get their baby names. Typically an MC is hired, does all the speaking for the chief. The chief sits up at the front there. Behind the ladies, there's a blanket with a drawing on it. So that's the back room where all the business happens. And the drummer's at the log there, and then the witnesses all sit up in the pews, and everything happens around the fire. So families will plan a potlatch to carry out whichever business they need to at the time. For us, it's usually a memorialization, and plan well over a year in advance. And the family pulls together, all the matriarchs come, and like I said, we're patriarchal. Women don't speak in the big house, but we do all the business. All of my aunts, my great aunts, they're the ones picking the names for people. They're the ones who are ensuring that every kid, every child gets a name, and where those names are going and who's getting which name. So they're making sure that the show goes on properly, and they're watching as well, very carefully, and whispering to ensure that business is going as usual. So gifts back in the 1800s, some example of gifts are animal furs and hides, carved bentwood boxes, slaves and coppers, wooden cedar blankets, canoes, and ulican oil. Gifts in the 1900s, blankets, pots, pans, dressers, copper bracelets, carvings, flour, sugar, and things that can be used in your household. So laundry baskets, anything that can be used in the kitchen, slow cookers, like mountains of slow cookers, mountains of flour and sugar to give to people. And like I said, usually at lunchtime, we're gifting all day long. So at lunchtime is usually when they give the flour and sugar. You can see people just carrying out their goods to their cars so they can make room for where they're sitting. Then gifts in the 2000s, towels, laundry baskets, slow cookers, and then silver jewelry, especially the really big name families want to show off. So they're hiring carvers to do all of this and giving away Indigenous carved jewelries. It's beautiful. Again, yeah.
Jen, it's Wendy. Just a question while we're on this slide. Someone asked, what's the significance of the fire?
Good question. I actually do mention that, but I will tell you now, it's our conduit to the spirit world. It's everything that happens around the fire is kind of the energy gets put in, and then there's actually a smoke hole there that everything all the smoke goes out that hole. So it's our way to kind of communicate with the spirit world. Great question. I don't think anybody's ever asked. Okay. Again, I could talk about this all day, but we should move on. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Potlatch Ban, which happened from 1885 to 1951. The Canadian government put a ban on potlatching. This lasted 66 years. So my grandfather pictured here was part of the survival of it. The story that was told to me was people had to go underground, really. They had to practice in secret, put blankets over their windows and practice in secret because they could go to jail if they were found practicing their culture. So in 1921, a man named Dan Kramer from Alert Bay held the largest potlatch recorded on the coast of BC at the village of my mother's village, which was Mimquamlease in Village Island. Just so you know, my villages, Turner Island and Village Island, are about an hour apart, and I haven't been to Village Island yet. But again, those are both off the coast of, kind of close to Alert Bay, I would say. So my grandfather pictured here, he was hired to MC that event. So he was about 19 years old. Federal authorities caught wind of it, and 45 people were arrested. Participants were given a choice to either surrender their artifacts or go to jail. My grandfather's parents thought it was less shameful for him to surrender his artifacts, so that's what he did. These are some of the artifacts that you can see here. What happened was they broke up the ceremony and then put all of these artifacts on a barge and shipped them across to Alert Bay, which was close by, out in the open, which was a shame, and put them out in front of a hall and had been charging tourists to take photos of these artifacts, which is again these artifacts are sacred and meant to be stored away and carefully when they weren't in use. So there's a story of the chiefs standing around, and even a picture that I didn't put up here, but of chiefs just standing in a circle next to this and just weeping because it was such a horrible shame. So many of these artifacts are in museums all around the world. Victoria and my grandpa's artifacts are in the Museum of the American Indian. To my knowledge, have not been repatriated, but hopefully in my lifetime, I would be able to see that. So this is a picture of my grandfather on the left. He's the one in the middle. This is a blanket that was passed down through the generations. There were 5 of them at one point. And there only remains 2. And one of them is the one that I'm wearing, which I wore to my convocation in 2017 for my master's. And it's just a side story that things that were passed down through the generations. This blanket is one of the oldest known Chilkat blankets that anybody's aware of. And the blankets were taken in warfare from the Tsimshian people. And I thought it was just amazing to be able to contribute to the history of that blanket by wearing it for my convocation ceremony. So 101 years later, my grandpa pictured there, and then me wearing it for my convocation. It was really amazing. This one as well, we could spend a lot of time on. This man named Derek Thompson, he speaks at Vancouver Island Caucus sessions, and it's a political forum. And this man always stands up, and when he speaks, he talks in story, which I found amazing. So I asked him if I could use this story in my deck, and he was happy to. And he's actually been approached many times to share it. Now it comes with a big write-up, but I'm going to do my best to not read the whole write-up because it's quite long. But the idea is a picture speaks 1,000 words. So the history of this is a 1781 watercolor by artist John Weber, who was an artist who traveled with Captain Cook. So it was produced on the 3rd voyage of Captain James Cook in Nootka Sound, which is on Vancouver Island. within the unceded territory of the Muwachat and Muchalat people. So basically they would travel around and this artist would capture and paint what he was seeing when they arrived at these villages when they were quote unquote discovering. And this is what he painted when they arrived in Nootka Sound in 1781. So again, looking at the holistic way of life before contact, the clothing, the tools, the weapons, the salmon drying on the ceiling, the house itself, likely made out of red or yellow cedar, the dirt floor, the smoke, the food being cooked on the fire, the carvings in the back, the hats up on the shelves, everything. Again, Derek does a much better job at retelling this, but it's just a great picture when you think of it in those terms. He also mentions what would an artist draw today if this were going to happen, and he speaks a lot about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the opioid crisis, intergenerational trauma, things like that. So really puts it into perspective. Again, we won't spend too much time there. Okay, guys, we're going to get into a little bit of contact. And again, I'm just reminding you some of it can be heavy. Just going to look at where we're at for time. Pretty good. So Canada at the time of contact was home to more than 2 million First Nations. BC alone was home to more than 200,000 people with 50 distinct languages. So BC right now is home to about 150,000 First Nations across the province. Just gonna let you read these for a moment. So the purpose of contact overall was to destroy the culture and take the land. We're going to talk a little bit about the Royal Proclamation, which was in the 1500s. Europeans began to establish settlements and were trading with First Nations. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation was issued by King George III, and this is where Aboriginal title and rights to the land was recognized. So basically it states that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. So I guess, again, the message here is we could spend a lot of time because there's a lot to know about treaties, but we won't focus too much on it. But basically I want to leave with the thought said by Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chief Satsan Herb George when he spoke about inherent rights. He quote says, means that we've always had it. It was given to us by the Creator. Satsan's an amazing, amazing man who's speaks a lot about and has a lot of knowledge about Aboriginal case law. So again, guys, there's lots to know here, but we're not going to focus a lot of time. Next, we talk about the smallpox epidemic. So through trade and travel, the smallpox virus was spread to almost every First Nations community in the province. Of course, no natural immunity to diseases introduced by Europeans. Indigenous people were decimated by waves of epidemics of smallpox, TB, scarlet fever, influenza, and measles. So this was another tactic used so that the lands could be claimed without having to compensate or recognize Indigenous title. In 1862, one of the worst smallpox epidemic hit BC, killing 1/3 of First Nations population, and eventually 90% of BC First Nations were decimated by smallpox. It hit so quickly that burials became an issue, and it went from mass burials to no burials. People were trying to flee and brought the sickness with them. One example is the Haida Nation, which went from about 10,000 down to just over 600. So today the Haida Nation is back up to about over 5,000. So just an awful, awful part of history. And not the first pandemic we've survived. Just on that note, like the First Nations, BC First Nations communities are doing amazing work at protecting themselves from coronavirus. And I mean, it is true. It is not the first time that we've been, hit with epidemics and pandemic. And I guess the message is we know how to take care of ourselves. The chiefs are doing a very, very good job of locking down their reserves. Next, we're going to focus, did I skip a slide? On the Indian Act. Once again, we could spend a lot of time on this. It is basically a very colonial policy that governs us from cradle to grave. When I heard that fact, it shocked me because I don't think many people know that, including First Nations, some First Nations people themselves. It is the oldest piece of legislation, which actually predates Canada 150. Basically, status, like our status and registration, is determined by a registrar that it's called Indigenous Services Canada, or ISC for short. Only ISC can grant us status. And then some of the restrictions that were imposed on us over time were introduction to residential schools, the creation of reservations or reserves, renaming individuals with European names. My daughter's family comes from Campbell River First Nation, and their family name is Quack Sister. That's their European family name, but their actual traditional name was Quaxistala. So that's just one example right there. They declared the Potlatching cultural ceremonies illegal, and also prohibited sale of alcohol and ammunition to First Nations. We will talk a little bit about enfranchisement. Basically, enfranchisement is a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status and conferring full Canadian citizenship. This was another assimilation tactic. So in 1857, it was voluntary, and there was an assumption that more First Nations people would do it. In 1872 to 1949, First Nations had no right to vote. And in 1960, you could give up your status for the right to vote. So just thinking back to this, the Indian Act, where someone is able to grant us status or not grant us status, and now they want to enfranchise us to get us to give up our status. So it's a bit confusing. So basically, you would be forced to give up your status if you wanted to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces, if you wanted to get an education, or if you left the reserve for a long period of time, for example, to go to work. If you were an Aboriginal woman and you married an Indigenous man, the women would have their status taken. So there were some amendments to this colonial policy. In one specifically in 1985 was Bill C-31, where many women gained their status back, and that was a big celebration. Again, really keeping in mind that most of us don't think about it because it has governed us for so long, that we are actually being governed by a very, very colonial policy. Next, we'll talk a little bit about residential school. I typically have a video to share during this time, and I don't right now, just for time purposes. But it usually gives me a bit of a time to take a breath, because this is where it gets a little heavier and it's difficult to talk about. So the Canadian government, in line with a goal eventually described as a plan to kill the Indian in the child, established a system of Indian residential schools. There were 22 schools across BC. In 1883, Macdonald passed a cabinet measure to create 3 residential schools in the West to be operated by Catholic and Anglican churches. So just a quote: "In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some may say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, then we must do that." So in the same year, he told the Commons, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his family who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. So this is why most residential schools were off reserve and children had to travel a long way to attend them. And they were forced to attend them because if they didn't, their parents were threatened with taking away their supplies, food supplies, things like that. So the impacts are what we see a lot of today. The video has actual residential school survivors who talk about hunger, the loneliness, that there was no real education happening in the school. They were stripped of languages and values, basically just describing themselves as broken. Another stat that I heard that was absolutely mind-blowing was the risk of dying in a residential school was greater than the risk of dying in the Second World War. So of the 150,000 children placed in residential schools, approximately 6,000 of them did not make it out. They passed away while in the school. And there are stories as well, even in my own family, about, you know, kids who went missing and no one talked about where they were, and they knew that they were in unmarked graves. So really awful things. Next we'll talk about Indian hospitals. This is where we start to think about cultural safety and humility. So this is really the start of the institutionalization of First Nations health. The populations had been hit, like we talked about, by various diseases: TB, smallpox, measles, mumps. So the early hospitals were mostly church run in a manner similar to residential schools, but slowly Indigenous Services Canada took control of the hospitals. So the purpose was, this is a quote, to fulfill the white man's burden to care for those less civilized and thus appear humanitarian to further assimilate Aboriginal peoples into the general population. So again, with residential schools, this separated families by large distances emotionally and physically, which was another segregation tactic. Some awful things happened in these hospitals, sterilization, medical experimentation. Some of these are just still coming out today. And the stories, you know, with residential school, even the abuses that were suffered there were every abuse. So physical, sexual, spiritual abuse, much the same as for Indian hospitals. So there was a hospital in Nanaimo, actually, and it's said that the records were to have been purposefully destroyed. So a lot of awful things happened in the residential schools and the Indian hospitals, some of which are still coming out today. What's significant about this photo in particular is the children are smiling, and, you know, I imagine their lives really aren't great, but they still have a smile on their face. So what we want to focus on here is the history of healthcare for Indigenous people in Canada has a very dark past, and there are still disparities within the system for Indigenous people. And this is where we talk about cultural safety and humility. So this is the First Nations Health Authority's description of cultural safety and humility. But I have heard this from somebody, and it makes complete sense. Everybody should have an elevator speech. So here goes mine. So cultural safety and humility. Humility is a concept. Cultural safety is an outcome. You can't have one without the other. And it's basically a lifelong self-reflecting journey that involves a lot of awareness, self-awareness, again, learning about what happened, understanding the history, I think is part of it. That it creates an environment where a person feels safe receiving healthcare. And there's a mutual respect as well. again, it's lifelong. It may not come easily, you know, and even myself, like I still have moments where in reflection, I realize that myself and or my colleagues that was us practicing cultural safety and humility, and that was that in action. So it goes for all of us, not just you know, non-Indigenous. It's a practice for each and every single one of us. Connie or, oh, there we go.
Hi there, here's poll 2. I am open to learning about cultural safety and humility. I'll give everybody a few seconds to make their choice. And okay, I think I see them coming in, so I'm going to stop the poll and I'll share the results. Can you see that, Jen?
Yeah, agree, 98%, neutral, 2%.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good stuff, guys. Okay, so we are coming to close to the end, and we're right on time for timing. I always include these photos because I am sharing my story. This is part of it, and this is my mom's mom and my dad's dad. Janet is holding my mother, and my grandpa Bert is holding me. So why I like to share this is because they were both survivors of residential school, and this is actually newer knowledge for me. I knew my granny Janet went, but I did not know that my grandpa went until a few years ago. So that said, it really, I'm still kind of realizing what that means for me and what it meant for me growing up. And to put it into perspective, I just think of, you know, the life my parents had. Mine was likely a little easier. The life that I had, my children's lives were likely a little better. And now Mateo will, you know, the ripples of the intergenerational trauma and colonialism are weakening. And that is really something when I, again, speak about my grandson, Mateo, who means the world to me. I would never, couldn't, you know, imagine him being impacted the way that my grandparents were impacted. And they took their stories to the grave. We actually don't know the horrors that they have survived. We only have an idea. So I just like to share that to put it into a bit of perspective. And as promised, oh, my screen's frozen again. We are ending on a positive note. So we're going to focus on the road forward, which for me is a reconciliation, lateral kindness, and cultural safety and humility. All for me go hand in hand in hand. Again, we cannot have one without the other. And we'll speak a little bit about people who have focused their lives, their messaging, and their energy on especially reconciliation. So this is Hereditary Chief Ian Campbell of Squamish Nation. He's an amazing gentleman, very smart, knowledgeable. They are matriarchal, I believe, because he speaks a lot when he tells stories about his matriarchs and listening to them. So matrilineal. And what's really interesting about listening to him and learning about the territories that I've lived on, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, is that we are really in their land, and you don't know until you hear the stories of the ways that they survived and the mountains that they used during the floods, and you know, it goes all the way up to Squamish Valley. It's absolutely amazing. Again, someone who talks in stories, and it's an amazing experience to even just listen. Art and culture, I like to just include this to focus on the fact that through all of that horror, our culture is still very much alive. I think that it's amazing that we can still have artists who are making a living and thriving with making their art. So this is my Uncle John. He made both those blankets. He's amazing. I won't focus too much on these, but this is George Littlechild. He's another First Nations celebrity. Again, another person who's been given doctorate degrees at universities because he's such an amazing artist. So we're going to focus on Murray Sinclair. So this is Senator Murray Sinclair. He's I'm totally a fangirl, and I always joke I don't stand in lines for much, but I stood in line to get this picture with him. He did a presentation for First Nations Health Authority employees, and of course I was there and intently listening, and he's done so much amazing work, too much to list. But again, he's been the face of Truth and Reconciliation, which involved listening to like hundreds of cases of what happened in residential school so that it was recorded. And his messaging is education is what got us here, and education is what will get us out. And he talks about the journey of reconciliation being not an Aboriginal problem, but a Canadian problem, and it involves all of us. So again, I like to show videos, but we don't have the time. But if you YouTube him, he's got short clips. He's absolutely amazing, just absolutely amazing. So I was shaking, by the way, when I took this picture. Next, we're going to chat a little about Chief Dr. Bobby Joseph. And this was right after he received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Inspire Awards in 2016. My Uncle John designed and drafted this vest that he's wearing. So I had to stand in line to take this picture as well because my uncle asked me to. He's like, "Can you get a picture of Bobby? I'm not going to be able to make it." So he's another man who's dedicated his life and messaging to reconciliation, and he has been very honest about his attendance at residential school. And it was described by the survivors in that video as them feeding their experiences to their children, really not knowing how to love because they were stripped of everything. So Bobby Joseph is one of the people who are, honest enough and brave enough to tell his story, and, mentioned that when he got out, he covered up his hurts with drugs and alcohol, and he was not a good father. And one day when he decided to get sober, and he said he just sat down with his adult children, and said, "I'm sorry that I was an awful father," and started their new journey together, healing together. And he's just amazing in his truth telling as well. And he says, each person has an important role to play in reconciliation. Reconciliation begins with oneself and then extends into our families, relationships, workplaces, and eventually into our communities. And he talks about eliminating labels. We need to support each other and be a model to the world. We have a shared history that is broken. We need to work together and together envision a new future that is more sharing and caring. So again, focusing on cultural safety and humility, reconciliation. We cannot have one without the other, because the very meaning of reconciliation is, again, looking at each of us having a role in it. And then we can go forward with things like cultural safety and humility when we understand the history. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to let Connie take it over.
Jen, I think you have to stop sharing your screen for me to take over.
There you go.
Awesome, thank you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, looks great, Connie.
Perfect. So just a little bit of my background. I'm the first generation of settlers from China and originally born and raised in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and Métis Nation in southern Alberta, also known as Calgary. I've worked at the FNHA for the past year and a half, and prior to that I was actually the registrar for the College of Opticians of BC. So I've had the unique opportunity to collaborate with CDHBC on some initiatives. Just a side story about the start of my cultural humility journey. Back in 2017, the former CEO of FNHA, Joe Gallagher, started meeting with all the registrars of the BC health regulatory bodies And he started opening our hearts and minds by introducing examples of how racism and unsafe healthcare interactions in our health system for First Nations had a negative impact on health outcomes. And it even resulted in things like death due to delayed diagnosis for time-sensitive illnesses like cancer. And that really struck a chord with me. And I know a lot of other registrars felt that way as well. It really felt like our blinders were removed because as regulators, it was our duty to protect the public. But it turned out that regulation, as with other parts of our healthcare system, only works for some groups and not others, especially vulnerable populations that need to be protected the most. And that's what really started my own journey of cultural safety and humility, to try to understand the healthcare experiences of all different groups of people and working towards really improving access and quality of care. So as you heard from Jen's oral account of First Nations history from a coastal perspective, colonialism, oppression, and cultural genocide intentionally disrupted the health and well-being of First Nations. Healthcare for First Nations people in Canada has traditionally been the responsibility of the federal government, but this has resulted in First Nations self-determination being undermined, and decisions about the health system were made for them, not with them, as part of the ongoing colonial structure that actually still exists today. Also, with Canada's colonial history, as you heard from Jen, there is understandably a huge lack of trust for government policies. So in 2013, FNHA was the first organization created in Canada to assume all health programs and services for First Nations people in BC. And I just want to emphasize how historical and monumental that moment was. The vision, leadership, and the level of faith and collaboration, because over 200 First Nations groups came together and believed that they can improve and change how healthcare was delivered for their people, that they could do better than what the government was doing. And this resulted in all First Nations communities in BC believing in doing something that's never been done before. And they've ended up forming the largest Indigenous healthcare organization in this country. We're working to reimagine First Nations health now that we have control over what is needed to address the unique health issues of First Nations and ensure that the system becomes safe and responsive. And the biggest shift is ensuring that First Nations people are self-determining and they're involved in the planning and management of health services for their people. The future state that we're working towards with our partners, including yourselves, is a health system that's aligned with the Indigenous community relational worldview to come together and heal in community, because the Indigenous way of knowing is that we're all connected, that everything is related, and that's why relationships and community is so important. FNHA has adopted a two-eyed seeing approach to work towards this future state. So we're basically moving away from Eurocentric colonial views of health and working towards weaving together traditional cultural healing and modern medicine by combining the best of both worlds to really support wellness by giving people what they need, not what we think they need, which is a crucial point to the decolonization of health services and programs. So I'm going to provide two examples of the work that FNHA has done recently to support self-determination and work towards decolonizing health programs. The first is our oral health program. So our goal is really to support health and wellness for First Nations by making sure that our oral health program is committed to a wellness-based approach. So we're basically working with communities to really understand what they need. And what they've told us is they want to bring oral healthcare closer to home in community by making sure that they have a provider. So currently we are working through avenues such as dental therapists that are employed in communities in order to deliver oral health care. We also work with the provincial health authorities to deliver the Children's Oral Health Initiative. And there's actually multiple communities that are fully equipped with dental clinics on reserve. One of the issues that we have is that even though there's these fully equipped dental clinics, there's not enough dental providers that are working in some of these communities. And so I just want to put it out there that one of the things that we are looking for is more dental providers and oral health providers to help us go into remote First Nations communities to provide care. The second example is our dental benefits program. So FNHA transferred our dental benefits that was administered by the federal government and transitioned it into BC to be administered by Pacific Blue Cross just this past September. And this transformation was huge. It's given First Nations of BC the ability to control what their dental benefits program and coverage looks like. I had no idea before I started working at FNHA the issues with accessing dental care. And I heard from dental providers that adjudicating claims was so challenging that it actually required dedicated office staff that specialized in NIHB, and that coverage was not enough to address the challenges that First Nations people had with oral health. And we heard similar issues from community members, in addition to how hard it was to access dental benefits, and sometimes people just gave up. So we really incorporated this feedback from both providers and communities to transform the dental benefits program. So the major changes included removing barriers by aligning our dental benefits coverage to professional fee guides. We've moved to an industry standard plan with improved coverage for major and preventative services. We wanted to make sure that administration was going to be fast and easy. So we've moved to an electronic processing wherever possible. And now there's complete transparency what the plan covers, so you can find the fee supplement online on PBC's website. So far, we've heard really positive feedback. We've heard from clients that they no longer have as much anxiety accessing dental benefits. And there was actually one dental provider that made me chuckle with one of the posts that she had. And she basically said she felt like Oprah, you get a crown, and you get a crown, and you get a crown. So Jen introduced the concepts of cultural safety and humility. Just to reiterate, cultural safety is an aspiration that we're heading towards with all healthcare providers. And cultural humility is that journey of self-reflection in order to understand our own personal and systematic biases, and it's a lifelong journey, and it's essential to acknowledge that there's so much that we don't know, and that we all have to learn about ourselves in terms of how we connect to others. I recently just finished a book called White Fragility, and it provided a history of how racism evolved to be viewed as good or bad, and why people don't want to be labeled as racist as a result. But if we're practicing humility, one of the realities is that we are all biased in different ways due to our personal experiences, societal stereotypes, and the media that's curated for us. One of the things I encourage you to do after the webinar is to Google the Harvard Business Test. It's a free online test that was designed by Harvard to reveal your beliefs and attitudes towards preference for things like people's race, age, nationalism, gender, and skin tone. If we're going to develop meaningful and ongoing relationship building with First Nations people, and just people in general, we need to be more self-aware to better understand the lens that we're viewing things from, and to create opportunity to make space for listening and learning to better understand others. One of the things that FNHA did last year was we engaged all First Nations communities and oral health providers with big ears to learn what worked and what didn't work when it came to dental benefits. And the feedback that we collected was really rich from community, with really good examples of what FNHA needed to do to support holistic Indigenous care. And also it really amplified examples of the barriers that First Nations face when trying to access benefit services. So to support you in your cultural humility journey, I wanted to share a couple of the examples that we collected from this engagement work. And while I'm doing that, to really encourage you in the back of your mind to reflect on some of these points. What did I know already? What did I not know? What knowledge and support do I need to continuously learn how to provide my clients with care that reflects their culture and background? Wendy, can you pop up poll number 3?
Yep, can you see it there?
Yeah.
Perfect. While we're waiting for everybody to post their thanks for answering some of the questions on the question and answer, Jen. That's very, very nice of you. Okay, I think everybody's done. I'm just going to share the results here.
Perfect, thank you.
96% agree.
It's frozen for some reason.
Oh, yeah, that did that to Jen too. I don't know why that happens.
I think eventually it goes, but.
Yeah, it goes eventually.
Okay. It must be a Zoom lag. While I'm waiting to go. Huh.
Still stuck?
It's very stuck.
Do you want, here, maybe what I'll do is I'll stop sharing your screen and then I'll take it back, Connie, and then
Oh, I see. Okay.
Is it working or? No, I don't think so.
No. Okay, I can.
Okay, I'm gonna take.
Maybe I will do this and try again.
I'm doing that. I'm sharing your picture again.
Okay.
I'm gonna stop sharing and then see if we can go back to you.
Okay. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So there was one of the examples I wanted to share. There was a time when First Nations people were used as guinea pigs and had our teeth pulled out instead of receiving proper oral health care. This is why so many of us have bad teeth now and get triggered at the thought of going for oral health services. So I think one of the lessons here that we learned is that there's still a huge learning curve when it comes to understanding trauma and supporting healthcare professionals to practice trauma-informed care. Trauma can come out in a lot of ways, like people getting triggered outside a clinic and not being able to make it for their appointment. We encourage when practicing trauma-informed care to just take the time to listen and calm someone down. Can go a long way. One of our dental therapists actually told us a story about how one of her First Nations clients couldn't make it inside the dental office and sit in the chair, but they spent some time talking about what was triggering that particular client. They recognized that person wasn't going to be able to be serviced that day, but they tried their best to listen to understand what the issue was. And subsequently, they were able to book another appointment and have that person able to be in the chair the next time. The other example we had was no dental provider in my city will direct bill PBC. As a single mother without a car, I have to rely on friends and family to drive me to the next closest city to access dental services. The travel takes place along the Highway of Tears, which can be unsafe to drive on, and I feel like a burden. So one of the biggest challenges we've had ever since we transitioned our administration of health benefits to BPC is that some of the communities where members are low income and can't afford to be out of pocket. And providers have the option to direct bill, but some still choose not to. So that's resulted in clients having to travel really long distances, sometimes in dangerous conditions, just to go see another provider in another city that does do direct bill. And the learning from this example is just to be aware of the realities of low income vulnerable populations that need care the most, but there continues to be a socio-economical gap between First Nations and non-First Nations people, as long as providers can pick and choose their clientele based on income level. So this learning model is what FNHA is using with providers to unlearn our deep-seated biases and discrimination and to recognize systematic and individual racism. And the point is to go on a journey of cultural humility to peel back the layers, to bring things into consciousness. It's gonna take unlearning of our own biases and relearn others, people's perspective and experiences. So the question we can ask as we work on our journey of self-reflection, how are we going to learn from each other? What creative things can we do to try to see how it goes? And also we really encourage for people to learn from failures. It's not a straight process to work towards cultural safety. It's going to take some experimentation. One of our goals actually for all healthcare professionals is to complete the Sanyas Indigenous Cultural Safety training with PHSA. So check it out sometime if you haven't done so yet. And I leave you with this question. What's one thing you can do to practice, to make your practice safer for First Nations people? I want to just take this moment to acknowledge that despite all the changes happening in our lives right now because of COVID-19, especially for RDHs, because dental clinics have been closed for the past couple months, you've all decided to dedicate this time to prioritize learning about cultural safety and humility. Some of the lessons that will come out of this pandemic aligns with cultural safety and humility because of the opportunity to deepen your compassion, self-care, and the wisdom that you have. These are obviously tough times, especially for people that are not working right now. And I think we can either give in to our fear and anxiety or take this time to train ourselves in steadiness, trust, and have a broader perspective. And more than anything, to be able to work on developing your sense of care and connection more deeply for everyone else. You're all powerful agents of change. Now more than ever, it's important to practice self-care and self-awareness. So I wish you the best in your cultural safety journey. Stay safe. And we thank you for listening. So I'm going to hand it over to Wendy to see if there's any questions.
Well, thanks, Connie and Jen. That was a very insightful presentation. I'm sure some of it, some people knew, and there was lots of, I'm sure, new information. Every time I listen to a presentation like this, I always learn something for sure. And thanks to Jen again for answering those questions. Someone did ask you if you could, Connie, if you could share your previous slide that you went through. I guess it would be 2 slides before that one.
This one?
That one, yep. Now, just a comment, Connie and Jen have gratefully indicated that they'll share their slide deck with us. So we'll put it up on our website. It'll be in our resource section. So if you have any questions, you can certainly email me. My email is wjobs@bcdha.com. You can find it on our website if you don't have it written down right there. So I'll ask a couple questions here. This was an early question. It said a patriarchal society. Others have mentioned that it was a matriarchal one. I didn't hear both terms throughout the presentation. If one of you could possibly maybe address that?
Yeah, sorry, I usually clarify. So like I said, there's 203 BC First Nations across BC. They're all unique and individual and different. I come from a patriarchal society, and lots of them are matriarchal. So they identify through their mothers. The women are the powerhouses in the family. They do all the speaking, but again, it's different with likely every nation. So it's that way for me, but for Squamish, they are matriarchal. They identify that way. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, great, thanks. So here, where can one take the cultural safety module?
So you can actually Google the Sanyas Indigenous Cultural Safety Training, and the PHSA website should pop up like the image here. And there's a direct link online to register. I believe it's either an 8 or 10 hour online module. It's about an hour a week, and it's moderated, and it's such a great learning resource in terms of the introduction to Canada's colonial history. It goes way more in depth in terms of some of the topics that Jen has brought up.
Right, perfect. And if anybody, if you didn't catch that, just email me and I can send you the link on how to, oh yes, and the link is probably on the CDHBC website. I see that Stacy mentioned that, so good point.
I think we actually have it also as a link in the slide deck. Our very last slide is a link to cultural safety resources. Yeah.
Perfect. Great.
It's Jen. I'll also add that when I started taking that training in 2012, when I began at the First Nations Health Authority, is actually it's such an amazing training. It's actually when I really started diving into the history of my own family. It's amazing. I totally encourage anybody who hasn't taken it to take it. Really triggered me to dive deeper and do some healing as well.
Yeah, I've taken it. It's a great module and course, and I think it's laid out and it's very organized. It's very easy to follow along and learn and have deep learning as well.
Yeah.
Just a comment here. I'd like to share the story of Brian Sinclair here. I learned about his tragic story during my graduate studies. It was very impactful for me and my healthcare providers. As healthcare providers, we can learn so much from his story and to not repeat history. And that was from Gordon. One other thing, we'll take one more question here. And what is I hear the term, and I did hear it in here, hereditary chief. What, I hear chief so-and-so, and I hear hereditary chief. What's the difference between a hereditary chief and somebody who's chief?
Awesome. I never have questions like this. I'm excited. So a chief, okay, so there's a couple different ways to look at it. So there's an elected chief, remembering that ISC, or Indigenous Services Canada, governs us as First Nations people. We are all registered under them, and as well, so are our reserve systems, since they're the ones who created the reservations. Again, kind of colonial, but also, I mean, I didn't ever grow up on a reserve, so I didn't have that sense of community with my members. We're kind of spread everywhere because we moved away from Turner Island, my dad, when he was about 5 years old. So you can either do the ISC elected chief and do it formally through your band members, or you can have a hereditary chief system. So what that means is that you're going back through your bloodlines and you're using that system as opposed to the elected chief system. So it's really just a technical term, I guess, where my uncle is the chief of my band and he's a hereditary chief. So he's been that way for years, like decades. It's time for him to retire. But in an elected chief position, you are in there for a term, right? So it's a certain amount of time. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thanks for the clarification. Yeah. And just actually, I was going to not ask any more questions, but I think these two are really key. If we want to, Robin asked, if we want to work in the remote areas, I'm assuming she means on a reserve, do we need to take the cultural safety training?
We do encourage dental hygienists to take the cultural safety training. It's ideal, but I know we are looking for providers, so it's not mandatory. It's more encouraged and a nice to have.
Okay, perfect. And what is the cost for the course? That wasn't Carrie asked that question.
I'm not 100% sure. I think it's around $200. It is posted on the website in terms of what the cost is right now for PHSA.
I can't remember how much it was, but that sounds about right. And I'm just going to go to my last slide there. I think I'm sharing. Am I scaring everybody see the frog?
It's adorable.
Okay. Thanks for attending, everybody. I know we went a little bit over on our time, but thanks for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. I had 75 attendees at one point, so that's great. I really have to thank Jen and Connie so very much for doing this for us. We really, really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll have you back again soon.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Okay, good night to all. And I did want to just a couple maybe housekeeping things. I hope everybody's staying healthy and safe during the COVID crisis that's going on. We're hoping to have some information from the colleges on return to work, hopefully by the end of this week, which then we're hoping to have, the college will hopefully get it out to you next week. And please take a few minutes. There's only a few short questions for the survey that you should be directed to as soon as you log out. And thanks very much for the small glimpse into the history of the First Nations people and communities. Good night, everybody.
Good night.